The fleet tried to outsmart the human strategist until she won the war without firing a shot. Then they tried to understand how she did it, which proved nearly as difficult as the original conflict. Let me tell you about the day I learned that humans don't just think outside the box, they convince everyone else the box never existed in the first place. Spoiler alert, the most devastating weapon in warfare isn't firepower, it's a human strategist with a whiteboard and absolutely no respect for conventional military doctrine. My name is Admiral Corvin Thrace, Supreme Commander of the Vraxian Imperial Fleet, and I have waged war for 34 standard cycles. I have commanded fleets numbering in the thousands, orchestrated campaigns across 27 star systems, and studied military strategy under the finest tactical minds in 7 different civilizations. Point is, I know warfare. I understand combat doctrine, what separates victory from defeat, what tactics work against which opponents. I can read a battlefield situation within minutes and adapt strategies accordingly. I have faced Krellian shock fleets, Thorian siege armadas, even the crystalline swarm tactics of the Zephyr Collective. I thought I had seen every possible approach to military conflict, every variation of strategy that existed within reasonable tactical parameters. Then I met Commander Elena Vasquez, and discovered that reasonable tactical parameters were apparently optional suggestions rather than fundamental constraints. The war started over mining rights to the Kellian asteroid belt, a resource-rich region claimed by both the Vraxian Empire and the Terran Colonial Authority. Standard territorial dispute, the kind that usually got resolved through negotiation or limited military posturing. Except negotiations had failed, posturing had escalated, and now both sides had committed significant military assets to the region with no clear path to resolution that didn't involve substantial bloodshed. The Vraxian High Command was confident. Humans were new to galactic warfare, only been spacefaring for maybe 80 years, barely long enough to develop proper fleet doctrine. They had smaller ships, fewer numbers, less advanced weapons systems. Every tactical analysis suggested Vraxian victory within 3 to 6 months of sustained conflict. We would dominate space superiority, cut off their supply lines, force surrender through overwhelming firepower advantage. It was textbook conquest strategy that had worked against 14 different opponents over the last century. Except humans apparently hadn't read the textbook. The Terran Colonial Authority sent Commander Elena Vasquez to lead their defensive operations, and my intelligence reports were initially dismissive. She was young by military standards, only 38 standard years, with limited combat experience and a background that included more diplomatic postings than battlefield commands. Her service record showed competence but nothing exceptional, nothing suggesting she would pose significant challenge to an experienced fleet commander with superior resources. My first communication with her should have warned me I was dealing with something unusual. Standard military protocol required initial contact between opposing commanders, essentially formalized threats and position statements before actual combat commenced. I expected the usual posturing, declarations of inevitable victory, attempts at intimidation. Admiral Thrace, Vasquez said when her image appeared on my command screen. She looked unremarkable, average height for a human, dark hair pulled back in regulation style, brown eyes that seemed almost friendly despite the circumstances. Thank you for agreeing to this communication. I wanted to discuss terms before we get into anything messy. There are no terms to discuss, I said, using my command voice that had intimidated countless opponents. The Kellian belt belongs to the Vraxian Empire by right of prior claim. Your forces will withdraw immediately or be removed by force. You are outmatched, outgunned, and facing an enemy with centuries of military superiority. Surrender now and I guarantee safe passage for your personnel. Yeah, that's not going to work for us, Vasquez said, her tone conversational like we were discussing lunch plans rather than warfare. The belt is Terran territory by legal charter, and we're not leaving. But here's the thing, Admiral, I don't actually want to fight you. Your wants are irrelevant. Military necessity demands conflict resolution through force when diplomacy fails, does it though? Vasquez asked, tilting her head slightly. Because I've been looking at the tactical situation, and honestly, fighting seems like the worst possible option for both of us. You'll win eventually, sure, your fleet is bigger and more experienced. But it'll cost you, what, maybe 30% casualties. That's thousands of personnel, dozens of ships, massive resource expenditure. And for what? Some asteroids that you'll have to defend forever because humans are really bad at accepting defeat. I felt my command staff shifting uncomfortably around me. Vasquez was supposed to be intimidated, supposed to recognize her inferior position and respond accordingly. Instead, she was conducting tactical analysis in casual conversation like we were colleagues reviewing strategy rather than enemies preparing for war. Human acceptance of defeat is not my concern, I said coldly. Vraxian victory is inevitable regardless of cost. See, that's interesting, Vasquez said. Because I've done some research on Vraxian military history, and you actually care a lot about costs. The campaign against the Thorian frontier cost 40% casualties and nearly bankrupted your war economy. The Zephyr conflict was abandoned after 22% losses despite clear tactical advantage. Your empire talks about glory and inevitability, but your actual behavior suggests you're pretty risk-averse when casualties start mounting. She had done her research, clearly. Those were accurate assessments of Vraxian campaigns that we preferred not to discuss publicly. Every war has costs, I said stiffly. Leaders accept necessary sacrifices, or, Vasquez said, we could avoid unnecessary sacrifices by finding a better solution. Give me 3 weeks, Admiral. 3 weeks to demonstrate an alternative to conventional warfare. If I can't show you a better path forward, we fight on your terms and I won't complain about the outcome. But if I can prove there's another way, you at least consider it before committing to massive casualties on both sides. You want 3 weeks to prepare defenses, I said, seeing through the obvious ploy. You want time to fortify positions and call for reinforcements. I want 3 weeks to change your mind about this entire conflict, Vasquez corrected. No additional fortifications, no reinforcements, just communication and creative problem solving. What do you have to lose, Admiral? If I fail, you get 3 weeks of intelligence about human command psychology and then proceed with your original strategy. If I succeed, you avoid a costly campaign and still achieve your strategic objectives. I should have refused immediately. Should have recognized this as a delaying tactic, a desperate attempt by an inferior force to postpone inevitable defeat. Should have commenced hostilities according to standard military doctrine and ended this war before it properly started. 2 weeks, I said instead, because curiosity had always been my weakness. You have 2 weeks to demonstrate this alternative approach. But any sign of defensive preparation, any attempt to bring in reinforcements, and negotiations end immediately. Deal, Vasquez said, smiling. You won't regret this, Admiral. Well, you might regret it a little, but not for the reasons you're expecting. The communication ended, and my second-in-command, Captain Vren, immediately voiced concerns. Sir, giving humans time to prepare seems tactically unsound. We should press our advantage immediately. What advantage are we pressing? I asked. They're entrenched in the asteroid belt with prepared defensive positions. Yes, we'll win an assault, but casualties will be significant. If Commander Vasquez wants to waste 2 weeks talking instead of fighting, that benefits us more than them, unless she's planning something, Vren said suspiciously. Let her plan, I said. We'll learn about human strategic thinking while maintaining full combat readiness. If anything seems threatening, we attack immediately. What followed over the next 2 weeks was the strangest campaign I had ever experienced. Vasquez didn't prepare defenses or call reinforcements. Instead, she started a public relations campaign. She released detailed analyses of the Kellyan Belt's resources, showing projected extraction timelines, profit margins, operational costs. She demonstrated that the belt contained enough valuable materials for both Vraxian and Terran operations without conflict, that fighting over exclusive access was economically irrational when cooperation would benefit both parties significantly more than solo exploitation. She published this information everywhere: galactic news networks, trade publications, economic forums, diplomatic channels. Within days, everyone in the civilized galaxy was discussing the Kellyan situation, and the consensus was increasingly that warfare over resources that could be shared was wasteful and stupid. This is propaganda, Captain Vren said, reviewing the latest human information releases. She's trying to turn public opinion against us. Public opinion doesn't win wars, I said, but I was less certain than I sounded. Vraxian military doctrine didn't account for information warfare at this scale, didn't consider public perception as a strategic factor. We focused on tactical superiority and overwhelming force, not public relations. But Vasquez was doing something more sophisticated than simple propaganda. She was conducting economic analysis and presenting it as objective fact, showing with brutal clarity that warfare would cost both sides far more than the resources were worth, that cooperation would generate significantly more wealth than competition. And she was doing it publicly, transparently, inviting independent verification of her calculations. By the end of week 1, 3 major Vraxian economic consortiums had published statements supporting her analysis. They noted that war costs would exceed projected mining profits, that the proposed cooperative arrangement would generate better returns for Vraxian interests than exclusive access obtained through costly military campaign. The Vraxian High Council, which generally supported military expansion, suddenly had to answer uncomfortable questions from economic interests about why we were pursuing expensive warfare instead of profitable cooperation. She's attacking our political support structure, I realized during a strategy meeting. This isn't military strategy, this is political manipulation, which should be irrelevant, Vren said. We have our orders from High Command. Political considerations are not our concern, but political considerations were becoming everyone's concern. By day 9, Vasquez had somehow arranged a joint economic summit between Terran and Vraxian commercial interests to discuss cooperative mining operations. She had gotten our own business leaders talking to human corporations about profit sharing, and those conversations were generating serious proposals that made warfare look increasingly unnecessary. This is unprecedented, my strategic advisor, Kelrith, said during our daily briefing. She's conducting diplomacy and economic negotiation under the framework of military conflict. I don't even know what to call this manipulation, I said grimly. She's manipulating every faction with interest in the outcome to pressure both our governments toward her preferred solution. It's working though, Kelrith said. The economic arguments are compelling, the profit projections are verified and accurate, and public support for military action is dropping precipitously. High Command is receiving significant pressure to reconsider the campaign. I contacted Vasquez on day 10, demanding explanation. What exactly do you think you're accomplishing, Commander? You're a military officer, not an economist or diplomat. This is outside your operational scope, is it though? Vasquez asked, that same casual tone that was becoming infuriating. Because my operational objective is protecting Terran interests in the Kellyan Belt. I'm accomplishing that objective using available resources and creative problem solving. The fact that I'm using economic analysis instead of weapons systems doesn't change that I'm doing my job. You're undermining military command authority by involving civilian interests in operational decisions. I'm demonstrating that military conflict isn't the only option for resolving territorial disputes, Vasquez corrected. You said yourself that warfare has costs. I'm showing everyone exactly what those costs are and offering a better alternative. That's not undermining authority. That's providing decision-makers with complete information. You're trying to force political leadership to overrule military strategy. I'm trying to save thousands of lives on both sides by preventing an unnecessary war, Vasquez said, and for the first time her voice carried an edge. You can call that manipulation if you want, Admiral, but I call it being responsible with the power I've been given. Warfare should be last resort, not default option. I'm making sure everyone understands what they're choosing if they proceed with military conflict, and if High Command proceeds anyway. Then I fight, Vasquez said simply. I fight with everything I have, and a lot of people die on both sides, and we all lose regardless of who wins the tactical engagement. But at least everyone will make that choice with full understanding of consequences and alternatives. That's all I'm trying to provide, complete information and better options. The communication ended, and I sat in my command chair processing what was happening. Vasquez had turned a military campaign into a public debate about the nature of conflict resolution. She had weaponized transparency, using accurate information as a strategic tool more effective than any weapon system I commanded. By day 12, the situation had escalated beyond military control entirely. The Vraxian High Council was in emergency session, debating whether to continue military operations in the face of massive economic opposition and public questioning. The Terran Colonial Authority was facing similar pressure, though their civilian leadership seemed more comfortable with Vasquez's approach than our rigid military hierarchy was. Economic groups from both sides had developed detailed proposals for cooperative mining operations, profit-sharing agreements, joint security arrangements. The proposals were sophisticated, professionally developed, and showed clear benefits for both Vraxian and Terran interests that far exceeded what either side could achieve through exclusive control obtained by warfare. She's going to win, Kelrith said during our strategy review. Not by defeating us militarily, but by making warfare irrelevant. By the time High Command authorizes offensive operations, political and economic pressure will force negotiated settlement regardless of military capabilities. That can't be legal, Captain Vren protested. There must be regulations against conducting warfare this way. There aren't, I said, having checked extensively. Because nobody ever conceived of conducting warfare this way. Military doctrine assumes opponents engage through force of arms. Vasquez is engaging through force of argument, and we have no defensive protocols for that approach. On day 14, my orders changed. High Command, under enormous pressure from multiple directions, authorized me to negotiate settlement terms with the human forces. Not surrender terms, settlement terms, as if this were a diplomatic dispute rather than military conflict. The shift in language was telling. Admiral Thrace, the High Commander's message read, "Analysis suggests that Commander Vasquez has successfully altered the strategic landscape through non-military means. Continuing hostilities would damage Vraxian economic interests and political standing. You are authorized to negotiate equitable resource-sharing arrangements that preserve Vraxian dignity while achieving practical objectives. Avoid terminology suggesting defeat or surrender." I contacted Vasquez to arrange formal negotiations, and she had the absolute audacity to look sympathetic. "I know this isn't easy for you, Admiral. You prepared for military campaign and got political maneuvering instead. That must be frustrating." "You manipulated the entire situation," I said, unable to keep bitterness from my voice. "You weaponized economics and public opinion to circumvent military authority." "I provided information and let people make informed decisions," Vasquez said. "That's not manipulation, that's transparency. The economic analysis was accurate, the cost projections were verified, the cooperative proposals were genuinely beneficial to both sides. I didn't lie or distort anything, I just made sure everyone understood the complete situation instead of only the military aspects." "You prevented warfare through political pressure rather than military capability. That's not how conflicts are resolved." "Why not?" Vasquez asked. "Why should conflicts only be resolved through violence when better alternatives exist? You're a brilliant military commander, Admiral. I read your service record, studied your campaigns. You went through superior strategy and overwhelming force. But why is that the only tool you're willing to use? Why can't we solve problems through cooperation, economic incentive, mutual benefit?" "Because that's not warfare." "Exactly," Vasquez said. "That's the point. It's not warfare, it's conflict resolution. Warfare is what happens when conflict resolution fails. I just made sure conflict resolution succeeded before warfare became necessary." The negotiations took 3 days and resulted in the Kellyan Cooperative Agreement, a framework for joint Terran-Vraxian exploitation of the asteroid belt with profit sharing, joint security, and dispute resolution mechanisms that made future conflict economically irrational for both parties. It was, objectively, a better outcome than warfare would have produced. Both sides got access to valuable resources without casualties or massive expenditure. But it felt like defeat anyway, because I had been outmaneuvered by an opponent who refused to fight on terms I understood. "How did you know this would work?" I asked Vasquez during a final communication before her forces withdrew to their designated operational zone. "How did you know you could prevent warfare through economic analysis and public information?" "Because I studied you," Vasquez said. "Not just your military tactics, but your culture, your political structure, your economic interests. I knew Vraxian society valued profit and practical outcomes, knew your military had to answer to civilian economic concerns eventually. I just accelerated that process by making the economic realities impossible to ignore." "That's intelligence gathering and psychological manipulation." "That's understanding your opponent," Vasquez corrected. "That's doing research and finding leverage points that don't require violence. Earth taught humans that lesson through thousands of years of costly warfare. We learned that the best victories are the ones where nobody dies, where everybody gets something they want, where conflict transforms into cooperation." "And if I had attacked anyway? If I had ignored the political pressure and commenced hostilities? Then I would have fought, and a lot of people would have died, and you probably would have won the military engagement but lost the political war," Vasquez said. "Your high command would have removed you for ignoring orders, economic interests would have punished your empire for costly unnecessary conflict, and humans would have eventually come back stronger and more determined. You would have won the battle and lost everything that mattered." She smiled slightly. "But you didn't attack, because you're smart enough to recognize when continuing down a path leads to bad outcomes for everyone. That's what makes you a good commander, Admiral. Knowing when to fight and when to accept better alternatives." The communication ended, and I sat in my command chair considering everything that had happened. I had commanded the largest fleet in Vraxian history, possessed overwhelming military superiority, had every tactical advantage. And I had achieved none of my strategic objectives through military force. Instead, A human commander with inferior resources had accomplished her objectives without firing a single shot, had won a war by preventing it from becoming a war, had defeated me by refusing to engage on terms where I held advantage. She outthought us, Kelrith said quietly. Completely and thoroughly. This will be studied in military academies for generations, as example of what? I asked. Brilliant strategy or complete abandonment of military doctrine? Both, Kelrith said. She won through means we never considered, using weapons we didn't know existed. Information, transparency, economic incentive, public opinion. None of that appears in our tactical manuals because we never conceived of warfare conducted this way. It's not warfare, I said, finally understanding. That's what makes it so effective. We prepared for war, mobilized for war, structured our entire approach around war. She prepared for conflict resolution and made war unnecessary. We were playing completely different games, and hers was better. Over the following months, I watched the Kellyan Cooperative Agreement succeed beyond anyone's expectations. The joint mining operations were profitable, efficient, and generated none of the security concerns that exclusive control would have created. Both Terran and Vraxian interests benefited significantly, and the arrangement became a model for resolving other territorial disputes across the sector. Commander Vasquez received numerous commendations from the Terran Colonial Authority and, surprisingly, recognition from Vraxian economic interests who appreciated that she had prevented costly warfare while securing access to valuable resources. She was promoted to Admiral, given command of Terran strategic operations across multiple sectors. I met her again 2 years later at a diplomatic function, both of us there representing our respective governments' interests in a resource-sharing negotiation for a different system. We had evolved from military opponents to something like colleagues, both working toward mutually beneficial outcomes rather than zero-sum conflicts. Admiral Vasquez, I said formally. Congratulations on your promotion. Well deserved, clearly, thank you, Admiral Thrace, she replied. And thank you for being reasonable during the Kellyan situation. You could have made that much more difficult. I could have gotten thousands of people killed for no strategic benefit, I corrected. You prevented that outcome through unconventional but effective strategy. I've spent the last 2 years trying to understand how you did it. Want to know the secret? Vasquez asked. Please, I asked better questions, she said simply. Everyone else was asking how to win the war. I asked whether war was necessary, whether better alternatives existed, whether we could transform conflict into cooperation. Different questions lead to different answers, and sometimes those answers are better than the ones everyone assumes are inevitable. That's not military strategy, no, Vasquez agreed. That's just problem solving without artificial constraints. Military strategy assumes conflict must be resolved through force. I rejected that assumption and looked for alternatives. Turns out alternatives are usually available if you're willing to look for them. I thought about that over the following years as Vraxian military doctrine slowly, reluctantly, began incorporating some of Vasquez's approaches. We started analyzing political and economic factors as strategic considerations, started asking whether military force was optimal solution rather than assuming it was only solution, started looking for ways to achieve objectives without warfare when alternatives existed. It made us better strategists, more flexible, more effective at actually securing our interests rather than just winning battles. The fleet tried to outsmart the human strategist until she won the war without firing a shot. Then we tried to learn from her, which proved more valuable than any military victory could have been. Because she taught us that warfare was one tool among many, that the best victories were the ones where everyone survived to benefit from the outcome, that intelligence and creativity could accomplish things that firepower never could. My name is Admiral Corvin Thrace, and I commanded the largest fleet in Vraxian history during a campaign that never happened. I was outmaneuvered by an opponent who refused to engage on terms where I held advantage, who transformed military conflict into economic cooperation, who won by making warfare obsolete rather than by winning battles. And I learned that the most devastating weapon in war isn't superior firepower or tactical brilliance, it's a strategist who questions whether war is necessary in the first place and then systematically dismantles every assumption that makes conflict seem inevitable. Commander Vasquez, now Admiral Vasquez, demonstrated that lesson perfectly during the Kellyan crisis. She didn't defeat the Vraxian fleet, she made defeating the Vraxian fleet unnecessary by creating better alternatives that served everyone's interests more effectively than violence ever could. That's not traditional warfare, but it's infinitely more sophisticated than anything in our military manuals. And it's why humans, despite being relatively new to galactic politics and possessing inferior military capabilities in most categories, have become unexpectedly influential in resolving conflicts across multiple sectors. Because they ask different questions, consider alternatives everyone else dismisses, and somehow convince entire civilizations that cooperation is better than conflict. They don't win wars through superior firepower, they win by preventing wars from happening in the first place. Which is, ultimately, the most effective military strategy possible, even if it requires abandoning everything traditionally associated with military strategy to accomplish it. The fleet tried to outsmart the human strategist and learned that humans don't just think outside the box, they convince you the box was always optional, then build something better where the box used to be, and somehow make you grateful they did it despite the fact that you were absolutely prepared to win the conventional conflict they refused to fight. That's not manipulation, despite what I initially thought. That's just being better at strategy than everyone who assumed strategy only meant tactics for winning battles. Sometimes the best strategy is finding ways to make battles unnecessary, and humans seem to understand that instinctively in ways other species have to learn through humbling experience. I learned it through Elena Vasquez, who defeated my fleet without fighting it, won a war by preventing it, and somehow made me respect her more than any opponent I had actually fought. Because anybody can win battles with superior force. It takes real brilliance to win wars without fighting them at all.